Picture this. It's March 15th, 44 BCE. The most powerful man in the known world walks confidently through the marble corridors of the Theatre of Pompey in Rome. He's dismissed his bodyguards. He's ignored multiple warnings from soothsayers, his wife's nightmares, and even a note pressed into his hand just moments before warning him of his impending doom. In less than an hour, this man will lie bleeding on the Senate floor, stabbed 23 times by his closest friends and allies. His final words, contrary to Shakespeare's famous dramatization, were not et tu, Brute, but rather a desperate cry in Greek to the young man he'd treated like a son. You too, my child? This is the story of how the Roman Republic died in a single afternoon, and how one man's assassination changed the course of human history forever. Hey, history lovers, if you're fascinated by the dramatic twists and turns of ancient politics, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we dive deep into the most compelling stories from the past every week. And if you enjoy this deep dive into one of history's most consequential assassinations, give this video a thumbs up to help more people discover these incredible true stories. Now, before we begin this journey back to ancient Rome, I want you to drop your location and time in the comments below. Are you watching over morning coffee in New York? During lunch in London? Or maybe it's late night in Tokyo? I'm fascinated by how people from around the world can learn about the same ancient story together. Caesar's influence is still connecting us over 2,000 years later. The year 44 BCE was supposed to be Julius Caesar's moment of ultimate triumph. After decades of military campaigns, political maneuvering, and civil war, he had finally achieved what no Roman before him had ever accomplished: absolute power over the Mediterranean world. He was dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, a title that sent shivers down the spines of traditional Romans who still remembered when their ancestors had overthrown the last king over 450 years earlier. But Caesar's rise to power hadn't happened overnight, and understanding his assassination requires us to first understand the man himself and the world that created him. Gaius Julius Caesar was born around 100 BCE into a patrician family that claimed descent from Venus herself through Aeneas, the legendary founder of the Roman people. But despite their noble bloodline, the Julii were not particularly wealthy or influential during Caesar's youth. Rome in the 1st century BCE was a republic in crisis, torn between the populares, politicians who appealed to the common people, and the optimates, the conservative aristocratic faction that sought to preserve the traditional power of the Senate. Caesar's early career choices made it clear which side he would choose. From his teenage years, Caesar showed both remarkable ambition and a willingness to challenge convention. When the dictator Sulla ordered him to divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of his political enemy Cinna, the young Caesar refused, even though this defiance forced him to flee Rome and nearly cost him his life. This early act of rebellion established a pattern that would define his entire career. Caesar would never back down from a confrontation, no matter the odds. After Sulla's death, Caesar returned to Rome and began his climb up the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of Roman political offices. But Caesar was never content to follow tradition. As aedile, he staged spectacular gladiatorial games that left him deeply in debt, but won him enormous popularity with the Roman masses. As Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, he gained religious authority that he would later use to justify his most controversial actions. And as governor of further Spain, he demonstrated the military brilliance that would make him one of history's greatest generals. But it was Caesar's partnership with Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus that truly launched him into the highest echelons of Roman power. This alliance, known to historians as the First Triumvirate, was a secret agreement between the three most powerful men in Rome to share control of the state. For Caesar, this partnership secured him the consulship in 59 BCE, and more importantly, the governorship of Gaul that would make his fortune and reputation. The Gallic Wars, fought between 58 and 50 BCE, transformed Caesar from a clever politician into a legendary conqueror. His campaigns against the Celtic tribes of modern-day France, Belgium, Switzerland, and parts of Germany and Britain were masterpieces of military strategy and political propaganda. Caesar didn't just conquer Gaul, he documented his conquests in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, a work of literature that served as both military memoir and campaign advertisement. Through these writings, every educated Roman could read about Caesar's tactical genius, his soldiers' devotion, and his mercy toward defeated enemies. The wealth that flowed back to Rome from these conquests was staggering. Caesar captured over 1 million slaves, seized countless tons of gold and silver, and transformed Gaul from a collection of warring tribes into a Roman province that would remain loyal to Rome for centuries. But more importantly, he forged his legions into a military machine of unprecedented effectiveness and loyalty. These soldiers didn't just serve Rome, they served Caesar personally, and their devotion to their commander would prove crucial in the years to come. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, the political situation in Rome was deteriorating rapidly. The triumvirate began to fracture as Crassus died fighting the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, and Pompey grew increasingly jealous of Caesar's military successes and popularity. The conservative senators, led by men like Marcus Porcius Cato, began to see an opportunity to destroy Caesar by turning Pompey against him. The crisis came to a head in 50 BCE, when Caesar's governorship was set to expire. Normally, a governor would return to Rome as a private citizen, vulnerable to prosecution by his political enemies. But Caesar knew that his opponents were preparing multiple lawsuits that could result in his exile or execution. He demanded the right to stand for consul in absentia, remaining safely in Gaul with his armies until he could take office and gain immunity from prosecution. The Senate, backed by Pompey, refused. In January 49 BCE, they passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, essentially declaring martial law and ordering Caesar to disband his armies and return to Rome immediately. Caesar's response was swift and decisive. On January 10th, he led a single legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy, uttering the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. By crossing the Rubicon with armed forces, Caesar committed an act of treason that made civil war inevitable. What followed was a military campaign of breathtaking speed and audacity. Caesar's forces swept through Italy so quickly that Pompey and the conservative senators barely had time to flee to Greece. Within months, Caesar controlled Rome, the Italian peninsula, and much of the western Mediterranean. But Pompey was far from defeated, and the war would rage across the ancient world for the next 4 years. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar's veteran legions demolished Pompey's larger but less experienced army. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking sanctuary with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. But the Egyptians, hoping to curry favor with the victor, murdered Pompey as he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and was presented with Pompey's head, he reportedly wept. Whether from genuine grief for his former ally, or from rage that his enemies had been denied the chance to show mercy. Caesar's time in Egypt became the stuff of legend, particularly his affair with Cleopatra VII, the brilliant and ambitious pharaoh who would become his ally and lover. Their relationship was both personal and political, cementing an alliance between Rome and Egypt while producing a son, Caesarion, whose paternity Caesar never officially acknowledged but never denied. From Egypt, Caesar continued his relentless campaign against the remaining Republican forces. He defeated Pharnaces II of Pontus so quickly that he sent the famous dispatch, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He crushed the Republican armies in Africa at the Battle of Thapsus, driving Cato to suicide rather than submission. Finally, at the Battle of Munda in Spain in 45 BCE, he destroyed the last significant Republican resistance, killing Pompey's sons and ending the civil war. Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BCE as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate, cowed by his victories, heaped honors upon him that were unprecedented in Roman history. He was made dictator for life, given the right to wear the purple toga and golden wreath of a triumphator at all times, and granted quasi-divine honors that made many Romans deeply uncomfortable. His image appeared on coins while he was still alive, breaking a centuries-old taboo against depicting living Romans on currency. But Caesar's greatest achievements lay in his domestic reforms. He launched a massive program of public works that employed thousands of Romans, expanded citizenship to people throughout the provinces, reformed the calendar to create the Julian calendar we still use today, and planned new colonies that would spread Roman civilization throughout the Mediterranean. He increased the size of the Senate, adding his supporters but also including former enemies in a gesture of reconciliation that seemed to herald a new era of unity. Yet beneath this surface of triumph and reform, resentment was growing among the traditional Roman aristocracy. Many senators felt humiliated by Caesar's dominance and horrified by what they saw as the death of the Republic. They whispered that Caesar planned to make himself king, a title so hated by Romans that it had been unthinkable for centuries. These fears seemed confirmed when Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a crown during the festival of Lupercalia in February 44 BCE, though Caesar refused it amid the crowd's mixed reaction. The conspiracy against Caesar began to take shape in the early months of 44 BCE. Its leaders were not his obvious enemies, but men who had benefited from his clemency and generosity. Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar treated almost like a son, was persuaded to join by appeals to his ancestor, the legendary Brutus, who had expelled the last king of Rome. Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had served under Caesar but harbored deep resentment over perceived slights, became the conspiracy's driving force. Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's closest friends and a beneficiary of his will, provided crucial inside knowledge of Caesar's movements and habits. The conspirators, who eventually numbered around 60 senators, called themselves the Liberators, claiming they were acting to restore the Republic. But their motives were complex and often contradictory. Some genuinely believed they were saving Rome from tyranny. Others were motivated by personal ambition, hoping that Caesar's death would create opportunities for their own advancement. Still others acted from jealousy or wounded pride, unable to accept that a single man had achieved such unprecedented power. The planning of the assassination revealed both the conspirators' determination and their political naivety. They chose the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, when the Senate would meet to discuss Caesar's planned Parthian campaign. The location would be the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting because Caesar's new forum was still under construction. Ironically, they would kill Caesar at the foot of a statue of his former ally and rival, Pompey the Great. As the Ides of March approached, omens and warnings multiplied around Caesar. The soothsayer Spurinna warned him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares about his death and begged him not to go to the Senate that day. The night before, lightning struck his house, and the sacrificial animals examined by the augurs showed unfavorable signs. Even on the morning of March 15th, another soothsayer stopped Caesar on his way to the Senate and pressed a note into his hands, warning him of the conspiracy. But Caesar, surrounded by well-wishers and petitioners, never read it. Yet Caesar dismissed his usual bodyguard of Spanish soldiers, either from overconfidence or from a fatalistic acceptance that if the gods willed his death, no amount of protection could prevent it. Some sources suggest he had grown weary of the constant precautions and preferred to die as a Roman should, facing his fate with dignity rather than cowering behind bodyguards. When Caesar arrived at the theatre of Pompey, the conspirators were ready. They had positioned themselves strategically around the Senate chamber, with some creating diversions while others prepared to strike. Decimus Brutus helped ensure Caesar entered the building by dismissing his lingering concerns about the day's omens, telling him that the senators were waiting and that it would be unseemly to disappoint them. As Caesar took his seat, a senator named Tullius Cimber approached him with a petition to recall his exiled brother. When Caesar refused, Cimber grabbed his toga and pulled it from his shoulders, the signal for the attack to begin. Publius Servilius Casca struck the first blow, aiming for Caesar's neck, but only managing to wound him slightly. Caesar spun around and grabbed Casca's arm, crying out in Latin, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" What followed was chaos. The conspirators crowded around Caesar, each eager to strike a blow and share in the responsibility for his death. Caesar fought back desperately, using his stylus as a weapon, but he was overwhelmed by the number of attackers. According to Suetonius, he received 23 wounds, though only one proved fatal. The moment that broke Caesar's spirit came when he saw Marcus Brutus among his attackers. According to different sources, his final words were either the Greek phrase "kai su, teknon," meaning "you too, my child," or simply a gasp of recognition and betrayal. Seeing Brutus with a bloody dagger destroyed Caesar's will to fight. He pulled his toga over his head to die with dignity and collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling on the marble floor. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the conspirators' fatal flaw. They had planned Caesar's death, but had no plan for what would follow. They expected the Roman people to rejoice at their liberation from tyranny, but instead they found a city in shock and confusion. The conspirators barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, while Caesar's body lay abandoned in the Senate chamber for hours before 3 slaves finally carried it home on a litter. Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul and most trusted lieutenant, proved far more politically astute than the assassins had anticipated. Rather than fleeing or seeking immediate revenge, he negotiated with the conspirators, agreeing to a general amnesty in exchange for being allowed to give Caesar's funeral oration. This decision would prove catastrophic for the liberators. Caesar's funeral became a turning point in Roman history. Antony's speech, immortalized by Shakespeare but based on historical accounts, systematically destroyed the conspirators' justification for their actions. He read Caesar's will, which left his gardens to the Roman people and a substantial sum of money to every Roman citizen. He displayed Caesar's bloodied toga, pointing out each knife wound and naming the senators who had inflicted them. By the end of his oration, the Roman mob was ready to burn down the city to avenge their beloved leader. The conspirators were forced to flee Rome as the city erupted in violence. Their houses were attacked, their supporters murdered, and their dreams of restoring the Republic lay in ruins. But the greatest irony was yet to come. Caesar's assassination had not prevented the end of the Republic, but had accelerated it. Within months, Caesar's great-nephew and heir, Octavian, arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance and avenge his adoptive father. What followed were 13 more years of civil war as various factions fought for control of Caesar's legacy. Antony and Octavian initially allied to hunt down and eliminate the conspirators, forming the Second Triumvirate with Marcus Lepidus and conducting brutal proscriptions that killed thousands of Romans, including the great orator Cicero. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, they defeated the armies of Brutus and Cassius, both of whom committed suicide rather than face capture. But the alliance between Caesar's heirs could not last. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra and his apparent plans to establish an Eastern empire based in Alexandria gave Octavian the perfect pretext for another civil war. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian's forces defeated those of Antony and Cleopatra, who fled to Egypt and eventually committed suicide as Octavian's armies approached Alexandria. Octavian returned to Rome as the sole master of the Roman world, but he had learned from Caesar's mistakes. Rather than accepting obvious monarchical titles, he styled himself as Augustus, the revered one, and claimed to be restoring the Republic while actually creating a new form of government that historians call the Principate. The Roman Republic was dead, but Augustus maintained the fiction that it lived on, with himself as merely the first citizen among equals. The assassins' worst fears had been realized. Caesar's death had not prevented monarchy, but had made it inevitable. The man they killed to save the Republic had become a martyr whose memory justified the imperial system that would rule Rome for centuries. Augustus ruled for 45 years as Rome's first emperor, creating a stable government that would endure long after the conspiracies and chaos of the late Republic were forgotten. But beyond its immediate political consequences, Caesar's assassination established patterns that would repeat throughout history. The justification of political murder in the name of higher ideals, the unintended consequences of eliminating charismatic leaders, the power of martyrdom to inspire future movements, all of these themes emerged from the events of March 15th, 44 BCE, and would echo through subsequent centuries. The historical Caesar was a complex figure who defies easy categorization as either hero or villain. His military genius was undeniable, his reforms were often progressive and beneficial, and his clemency toward former enemies was remarkable by the standards of his time. Yet he also destroyed the Roman Republic, enriched himself through conquest and plunder, and showed a ruthless ambition that brooked no opposition. His assassination was both a tragedy and an inevitability, the result of his own actions and the structural problems of the late Roman Republic. The conspirators, too, resist simple judgment. Men like Brutus were motivated by genuine conviction that they were saving Rome from tyranny, yet their actions ultimately destroyed the very institution they sought to preserve. Their political idealism was admirable, but their practical planning was catastrophically inadequate. They understood how to kill Caesar, but not how to manage the consequences of his death. The story of Caesar's assassination also reveals the power of narrative and myth in shaping historical memory. Shakespeare's dramatization of these events has proven more influential than the historical record, creating an image of Caesar as an ambitious tyrant and Brutus as a noble if misguided patriot. But the reality was more complex. Caesar was popular with the Roman people. and his assassins were primarily motivated by aristocratic self-interest rather than republican virtue. Modern parallels to Caesar's assassination are inevitable but dangerous. Every political system struggles with the tension between strong leadership and institutional constraints, between the need for decisive action and the fear of concentrated power. Caesar's Rome faced challenges not unlike those confronting modern democracies: economic inequality, political polarization, the breakdown of traditional norms, and the rise of populist leaders who appealed directly to the masses over the heads of established institutions. The methods Caesar used to gain power, military conquest, personal charisma, appeals to popular grievances, and the cultivation of personal loyalty among soldiers and supporters, remain remarkably relevant to understanding political movements throughout history. Similarly, the conspirators' justifications for their actions, that they were defending constitutional government against tyranny, that sometimes violence is necessary to preserve freedom, that the ends justify the means, continue to resonate in contemporary political discourse. Yet the lesson of Caesar's assassination is not that strong leaders should never be opposed or that political violence is always counterproductive. Rather, it's that the destruction of established institutions, even flawed ones, often leads to outcomes far worse than the problems they were meant to solve. The Roman Republic had serious structural problems that Caesar both exploited and attempted to address, but its complete collapse created centuries of autocratic rule that the conspirators never intended or desired. The personal dimensions of the assassination also remain compelling across the millennia. The relationship between Caesar and Brutus, whether the older man genuinely loved the younger as a son, or whether their bond was primarily political, adds a tragic element to the story that has fascinated writers and audiences ever since. The image of Caesar's surprise and heartbreak upon seeing Brutus among his attackers speaks to universal themes of betrayal, loyalty, and the pain of discovering that those we trust most are capable of destroying us. Similarly, the role of omens and warnings in the story raises questions about fate, free will, and the responsibility individuals bear for their own destruction. Caesar received numerous warnings, but chose to ignore them, whether from fatalism, pride, or simple disbelief that his own allies would turn against him. His decision to dismiss his bodyguards on the morning of his death suggests either supreme confidence or a death wish that has puzzled historians for centuries. The broader context of Caesar's assassination also illuminates the fragility of political institutions and the difficulty of managing transitions of power in complex societies. The Roman Republic had governed the Mediterranean world for centuries, but its institutions were designed for a city-state, not a global empire. The wealth and complexity that came with expansion created new pressures that the traditional system could not handle, leading to the breakdown of norms and the rise of strongmen who operated outside established procedures. Caesar's reforms, many of which were continued by Augustus and his successors, addressed real problems in Roman society: corruption in provincial government, the concentration of wealth among a small elite, the need for infrastructure improvements, and the integration of diverse populations into a coherent political system. His assassination prevented the completion of these reforms, but could not address the underlying issues that made them necessary. The international dimensions of Caesar's death also deserve attention. His assassination occurred at a moment when Rome was planning major military campaigns against the Parthian Empire, which controlled much of modern-day Iran and Iraq. These plans were abandoned after his death, potentially altering the balance of power in the ancient Near East and affecting the development of trade routes, cultural exchange, and religious movements throughout the region. The role of Egypt and Cleopatra in the story adds another layer of complexity, highlighting the intersection of Roman politics with the broader Mediterranean world. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar, and later with Mark Antony, was both personal and diplomatic, representing Egypt's attempt to maintain independence by allying with powerful Romans. Her ultimate defeat by Augustus marked the end of Ptolemaic Egypt and the incorporation of one of the ancient world's oldest civilizations into the Roman Empire. The military aspects of Caesar's career and death also merit consideration. His tactical innovations, particularly his use of engineering and siege warfare, influenced military practice for centuries. His soldiers' loyalty to him personally, rather than to the Roman state, represented a dangerous shift that would characterize the imperial period, when armies served emperors rather than the republic. The civil wars that followed his assassination were fought by veterans who had learned their trade in his legions, spreading his tactical methods throughout the Roman world. The economic consequences of Caesar's assassination were equally significant. His death disrupted planned public works projects, colonial foundations, and commercial ventures that might have strengthened the Roman economy and provided opportunities for social mobility. The civil wars that followed consumed enormous resources and destabilized trade throughout the Mediterranean, contributing to economic problems that would plague the empire for generations. The cultural and intellectual impact of these events also resonates across time. Caesar's own literary works, particularly his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, established new standards for military memoirs and political propaganda. His assassination inspired countless works of literature, drama, and art, from ancient historians like Plutarch and Suetonius to modern novelists and filmmakers. The story has been retold and reinterpreted by each generation, reflecting contemporary concerns about power, ambition, loyalty, and the costs of political change. The religious and philosophical dimensions of the story also deserve attention. Caesar's claims to divine descent and the posthumous deification granted by the Senate reflected changing attitudes toward leadership and authority in the ancient world. His transformation from mortal politician to divine ancestor of the imperial family represented a fundamental shift in Roman religious and political culture that would influence the development of ruler cults throughout the empire. The conspiracy against Caesar also reflected tensions between different philosophical schools and their approaches to political action. Stoic concepts of duty and virtue motivated some conspirators, while Epicurean ideas about friendship and loyalty influenced others. These philosophical differences affected how various Romans understood their obligations to the state, their leaders, and each other, contributing to the political instability that characterized the late Republic. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in ancient history, we're reminded that individual actions, however dramatic, are always embedded in larger historical processes. Caesar's assassination was simultaneously the result of his personal choices and the structural problems of the Roman Republic. The conspirators were both noble idealists and narrow-minded aristocrats defending their privileges. The consequences were both predictable and utterly unexpected. The story of Julius Caesar's assassination ultimately transcends its ancient Roman context to illuminate timeless questions about power, leadership, loyalty, and the unintended consequences of political action. It reminds us that history is made by human beings with complex motivations, limited understanding, and the capacity for both greatness and tragic miscalculation. The Ides of March, 44 BCE, changed the course of Western civilization, not because of any grand design, but because of a series of individual decisions that, taken together, destroyed one world and created another. In our own time, as we grapple with questions about democratic institutions, authoritarian tendencies, and the proper limits of political power, the story of Caesar and his assassins offers no easy answers, but provides valuable perspective on the enduring challenges of human governance. The Roman Republic died on March 15th, 44 BCE, but the questions it raised about freedom, order, and the price of political change remain as relevant today as they were over 2,000 years ago. The blood that pooled around Pompey's statue that March afternoon marked not just the end of one man's extraordinary life, but the beginning of a new chapter in human history. From the chaos of that moment would emerge the Roman Empire, one of history's most enduring political institutions, and with it the foundations of the Western world as we know it. The conspirators who struck down Caesar in the name of liberty could never have imagined that their actions would ultimately create a system of government that would endure for centuries and influence every subsequent attempt to organize human societies on a grand scale. And so we return to that marble floor, stained with the blood of ambition and idealism, where the most powerful man in the world breathed his last breath and changed the course of human history forever. But the story of Caesar's assassination doesn't end with his death. In many ways, it was just the beginning of an even more dramatic and consequential chapter in the history of the ancient world. The immediate hours following Caesar's assassination revealed the conspirators' complete lack of preparation for governing in the aftermath of their deed. As Caesar's lifeless body lay beneath Pompey's statue, the senators who had struck him down found themselves paralyzed by the magnitude of what they had done. The theater of Pompeii became a scene of chaos as senators fled in terror, some not even knowing whether they were targets of a broader conspiracy or merely witnesses to an isolated act of violence. Marcus Brutus, covered in Caesar's blood, attempted to address the remaining senators, but his speech fell on deaf ears. The conspirators had expected to be hailed as liberators, but instead they found themselves facing a mixture of horror, confusion, and barely contained fury from their colleagues. Even those senators who had opposed Caesar were shocked by the brutality of his end and uncertain about what would follow. The conspirators' decision to spare Mark Antony proved to be their most crucial mistake. Antony had been Caesar's most loyal lieutenant, his co-consul, and the man most likely to inherit his political legacy. Decimus Brutus had argued for killing Antony alongside Caesar, but Marcus Brutus had insisted that they were liberators, not murderers, and that killing Antony would make them appear as common assassins rather than defenders of the Republic. This moment of moral squeamishness would cost the conspirators everything. As news of the assassination spread through Rome, the city's reaction was not what the conspirators had anticipated. Rather than celebrating their liberation from tyranny, the Roman people were shocked and afraid. Caesar had been genuinely popular among the urban masses, who had benefited from his public works projects, his generous distributions of grain, and his spectacular entertainments. His veteran soldiers, many of whom had settled in Rome after their service, regarded him as a father figure who had enriched them with the spoils of conquest and promised them land and security in their old age. The immediate aftermath also revealed the extent to which Roman society had become dependent on Caesar's personal authority. Government officials, uncertain about their legal status and afraid of reprisals, simply stopped functioning. The courts closed, public works projects halted, and commercial activity ground to a standstill as merchants and bankers waited to see what would emerge from the political chaos. Mark Antony's initial response to the crisis was masterful. Rather than immediately seeking revenge or fleeing the city, he retreated to his house and began a careful campaign to position himself as Caesar's legitimate heir. He sent messages to key military commanders, reminding them of their oaths of loyalty to Caesar and suggesting that this loyalty now transferred to him. He reached out to Caesar's veterans, promising to honor their dead leaders' commitments to them. Most importantly, he gained control of Caesar's papers and private funds, giving him both the legal authority and the financial resources to act in Caesar's name. The conspirators, meanwhile, had barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, the traditional refuge of Roman politicians in times of crisis. They issued proclamations declaring their loyalty to the Republic and calling for a return to constitutional government. But their words rang hollow in a city that had witnessed the brutal murder of its leader. Their attempt to rally support by appealing to Republican traditions failed to resonate with a population that had grown accustomed to Caesar's innovative and generous leadership. The critical moment came when Antony proposed a meeting with the conspirators to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the crisis. This negotiation, which took place on March 17th, just 2 days after the assassination, revealed the fundamental weakness of the conspirators' position. They had acted without any plan for governing Rome or dealing with the immediate practical consequences of Caesar's death. Antony, by contrast, had spent those 2 days building a coalition of Caesar's supporters and positioning himself as the guardian of stability and continuity. The agreement that emerged from this negotiation was a masterpiece of political maneuvering by Antony. In exchange for agreeing not to prosecute the conspirators for Caesar's murder, Antony secured their agreement to honor all of Caesar's acts and appointments as dictator. This seemingly reasonable compromise actually gave Antony enormous power, as he controlled Caesar's papers and could essentially discover new decrees and appointments that served his political purposes. The conspirators, desperate to avoid immediate prosecution, agreed to terms that effectively legitimized Caesar's entire regime while leaving them with no real authority. But Antony's most brilliant stroke was his insistence on being allowed to deliver Caesar's funeral oration. The conspirators, still clinging to the hope that they could present themselves as liberators rather than murderers, agreed to this request, thinking that a dignified funeral might help restore order to the city. They could not have made a more catastrophic error. Caesar's funeral, held on March 20th, became a political earthquake that destroyed any possibility of the conspirators' success. Antony's speech, delivered from the rostra in the Roman Forum, was a masterpiece of rhetorical manipulation that turned the Roman people irrevocably against the assassins. He began by acknowledging the conspirators' claims that Caesar had been a tyrant, but then systematically demolished their arguments by recounting Caesar's generosity, his military victories, and his reforms that had benefited ordinary Romans. The turning point came when Antony read Caesar's will, which revealed the dead dictator's extraordinary generosity to the Roman people. Caesar had left his private gardens across the Tiber to the citizens of Rome as a public park, and he had bequeathed 75 denarii to every Roman citizen, a sum that represented months of wages for a working man. This revelation transformed the crowd's mood from grief to fury, as they realized that the man the conspirators had called a tyrant had been more generous to them than any leader in Roman history. Antony then displayed Caesar's bloodied toga, pointing to each tear in the fabric and naming the senator who had inflicted the corresponding wound. He described how Caesar had fought desperately for his life until he saw Brutus among his attackers, at which point he had covered his face with his toga and resigned himself to death. The crowd's reaction was explosive. They began calling for the blood of the conspirators and demanding that Caesar be avenged. The funeral pyre that followed was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. The mourning citizens brought furniture, clothing, and even musical instruments to fuel the flames that consumed Caesar's body. Veterans threw their weapons and decorations into the fire, while women added their jewelry and their children's toys. The pyre burned so intensely that it damaged nearby buildings, and the crowd's grief transformed into a mob seeking vengeance against the conspirators. Within hours of the funeral, gangs of armed citizens were attacking the houses of the conspirators, forcing them to flee Rome permanently. The dream of restoring the Republic died in the flames of Caesar's pyre, replaced by a thirst for revenge that would consume the Roman world for the next 13 years. The conspirators' flight from Rome marked the beginning of their systematic destruction, but it also revealed the fundamental contradictions in their movement. Many of them had joined the conspiracy not from genuine Republican convictions, but from personal grievances against Caesar or hopes of advancing their own careers. Once they were exiled from Rome and stripped of their offices and properties, these personal motivations became clear, and the conspiracy began to fragment. Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, the two most prominent conspirators, initially attempted to maintain some semblance of republican government by taking up their assigned provincial commands in the east. But their efforts to raise armies and funds were hampered by their status as public enemies and by the growing power of Caesar's heirs. The eastern provinces, which had benefited enormously from Caesar's policies, showed little enthusiasm for supporting his assassins. Meanwhile, in Rome, the political situation was evolving rapidly in ways that the conspirators had never anticipated. The most significant development was the arrival of Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son, who had been studying in Greece when news of the assassination reached him. Against the advice of his friends and family, the young man decided to return to Rome and claim his inheritance, taking the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus to emphasize his connection to the dead dictator. Octavian's arrival in Rome created a new dynamic that neither Antony nor the conspirators had anticipated. The young man was physically unimpressive, frequently ill, and had no military experience, but he possessed two crucial advantages. He was Caesar's legal heir, and he had access to the vast fortune that Caesar had accumulated during his career. More importantly, he understood that Caesar's legacy was his greatest asset, and he was willing to use it more ruthlessly than even Antony had imagined. The relationship between Antony and Octavian began as an uneasy alliance, but quickly devolved into rivalry and then open hostility. Antony, who was more than 20 years older and had been Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, initially treated Octavian as a junior partner at best. But the young man's political instincts were remarkably sharp, and he quickly began building his own power base by appealing directly to Caesar's veterans and using his inherited wealth to fund games and public works that won him popularity with the Roman masses. The first major confrontation between Antony and Octavian came over the question of pursuing Caesar's assassins. Octavian, despite his youth and inexperience, understood that his legitimacy depended entirely on his role as Caesar's avenger. He began recruiting an army from Caesar's veterans, promising them land and bonuses in exchange for their loyalty. Antony, who had been proceeding more cautiously in his pursuit of the conspirators, found himself outflanked by his supposed ally. The situation became even more complex when the Senate, led by the orator Cicero, attempted to use the rivalry between Antony and Octavian to restore senatorial authority. Cicero, who had been one of Caesar's most eloquent opponents, saw an opportunity to destroy Antony by supporting Octavian while simultaneously using the young man's inexperience to limit his power. This strategy, which Cicero laid out in a series of speeches, known as the Philippics, represented the last attempt by the traditional republican establishment to regain control of Roman politics. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Cicero's strategy might succeed. Octavian allied with the Senate against Antony, and their combined forces defeated Antony's army at the Battle of Mutina in 43 BCE. But the victory proved Pyrrhic, as both consuls were killed in the fighting, leaving Octavian in command of the Senate's forces. Rather than allowing himself to be used as a tool of the Senate, Octavian marched on Rome and demanded the consulship despite being far below the legal age for the office. The Senate's capitulation to Octavian's demands marked the end of any realistic hope for restoring the Republic. The young man's consulship was transparently unconstitutional, but his control of the armies made resistance impossible. More ominously, Octavian used his new position to pass a law officially condemning Caesar's assassins and authorizing their prosecution for treason. The conspirators were now not just political enemies, but legal criminals whose property could be confiscated and whose supporters could be punished. The final blow to the conspirators came when Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate in November 43 BCE. Unlike the secret alliance that had bound Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this triumvirate was a legal arrangement that gave its members extraordinary powers to restore order to the Republic. In practice, it was a military dictatorship that divided the Roman world among three warlords, united by their determination to destroy Caesar's assassins. The triumvir's first act was to conduct a massive proscription, a legalized reign of terror that eliminated their political enemies and raised funds for their military campaigns. The proscription lists included not only the conspirators and their active supporters, but also wealthy Romans whose property the triumvirs coveted and personal enemies who had offended them in the past. The most famous victim was Cicero, whose head and hands were displayed on the rostra, where he had delivered his greatest speeches. The proscriptions revealed the extent to which Caesar's assassination had brutalized Roman politics. The conspirators had justified their actions by claiming that Caesar's rule was illegitimate and that his death would restore constitutional government. Instead, his assassination had created a cycle of violence that consumed the Roman Republic entirely. The triumvir's use of legal mechanisms to justify mass murder showed how thoroughly the rule of law had collapsed in the aftermath of Caesar's death. With their enemies in Rome eliminated or driven into exile, the triumvirs turned their attention to the conspirators who had established themselves in the eastern provinces. Brutus and Cassius had spent the 2 years since Caesar's assassination building armies and collecting funds, but their resources were dwarfed by those of the triumvirs. More importantly, they were fighting not just for their own lives, but for a political ideal, the Roman Republic, that had already been destroyed by the very act that was supposed to save it. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, where the armies of the triumvirs faced those of the conspirators in what was essentially a contest between Caesar's legacy and the republican tradition. The battle itself was a confused affair fought in 2 phases, but its outcome was never really in doubt. The triumvirs commanded the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, who were fighting to avenge their beloved commander, while the conspirators led armies that included many soldiers who had once served under Caesar and were now being asked to fight against his memory. The deaths of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi marked the end of the conspiracy that had begun with such high hopes on the Ides of March. Both men committed suicide rather than face capture, but their deaths were more than just personal tragedies. They represented the final extinction of the Roman Republic as a political ideal. The conspirators had killed Caesar to preserve the Republic, but their own deaths confirmed that the Republic was beyond saving. The aftermath of Philippi also revealed the extent to which Caesar's assassination had transformed the Roman world. The triumvir's division of the provinces created a new political geography that bore no resemblance to the traditional Roman system. Octavian took control of the west, Antony commanded the east, and Lepidus was assigned Africa. But these assignments were based on military power rather than constitutional authority. The Senate continued to exist, but it was now merely a rubber stamp for the triumvir's decisions. The relationship between Octavian and Antony, which had been strained even during their alliance against the conspirators, deteriorated rapidly after Philippi. Antony's involvement with Cleopatra, which began as a political alliance but developed into a genuine love affair, gave Octavian the perfect opportunity to present himself as the defender of Roman values against foreign corruption. The propaganda war between the two men gradually escalated into actual warfare, with each side claiming to represent Caesar's true legacy. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces defeated those of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle was less decisive militarily than politically, as many of Antony's supporters defected to Octavian rather than face certain defeat. Antony and Cleopatra's subsequent suicides in Alexandria marked the end of the civil wars that had begun with Caesar's assassination 17 years earlier. Octavian's victory at Actium made him the sole ruler of the Roman world, but it also confronted him with the same problem that had ultimately destroyed Caesar: how to exercise monarchical power in a republic that theoretically rejected monarchy. Octavian's solution was more subtle than Caesar's approach. Rather than accepting titles like dictator or king that would have alarmed traditional Romans, he carefully constructed a new form of government that preserved the appearance of the republic while concentrating real power in his own hands. The constitutional settlement that emerged from this process, known to historians as the Principate, was officially presented as a restoration of the Republic. Octavian, now known as Augustus, claimed to be merely the first citizen among equals, but his control of the armies, his religious authority as Pontifex Maximus, and his vast personal wealth made him effectively an emperor in all but name. The Senate continued to meet and debate, but its decisions were subject to Augustus's approval, and its membership was carefully managed to ensure compliance with his wishes. The irony of Augustus's success was that he achieved everything Caesar had wanted while avoiding the fate that had befallen his adoptive father. By moving more gradually and maintaining republican forms, Augustus created a stable autocracy that would endure for centuries. The conspirators who had killed Caesar to prevent the establishment of a monarchy had instead created conditions that made monarchy inevitable, and their victim's heir had proven more politically astute than Caesar himself. The transformation of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire was not just a change of government, but a fundamental alteration in the nature of Mediterranean civilization. The Principate that Augustus established would provide the political framework for the spread of Christianity, the development of Roman law, and the cultural synthesis that we call classical civilization. The conspirators who struck down Caesar could never have imagined that their actions would ultimately contribute to the creation of a system that would shape Western civilization for centuries to come. But perhaps the most profound consequence of Caesar's assassination was its impact on the Roman conception of political leadership. Caesar's death and deification established the idea that exceptional individuals could transcend normal human limitations and achieve a kind of immortality through their actions. This concept, which had been foreign to traditional Roman values, became central to the imperial system and influenced every subsequent Roman emperor's understanding of his role. The cult of Caesar that developed after his assassination was not merely a political tool, but a genuine religious phenomenon that reflected the transformation of Roman society. Caesar's temple in the Forum, built on the spot where his body had been cremated, became a center of worship that drew pilgrims from throughout the empire. His birthday became a public holiday, and his image appeared on coins and statues throughout the Roman world. The man who had been murdered for his supposed tyranny had become a god whose memory legitimized the rule of his successors. The long-term consequences of Caesar's assassination extended far beyond the political realm. The civil wars that followed his death disrupted trade, destroyed cities, and killed hundreds of thousands of people throughout the Mediterranean world. The economic and social changes that resulted from this upheaval contributed to the transformation of Roman society from a citizen republic to a subject empire, with profound implications for the development of law, culture, and religion in the ancient world. And so we return to that marble floor, stained with the blood of ambition and idealism, where the most powerful man in the world breathed his last breath and changed the course of human history forever. The assassination of Julius Caesar reminds us that the arc of history is not inevitable, but is shaped by the choices of individuals who, like all of us, must act on incomplete information and face consequences they can neither fully predict nor control. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all, that history is not a story of grand forces and inevitable outcomes, but of human beings, with all their virtues and flaws, making decisions that echo across the centuries. The conspirators who killed Caesar believed they were saving the Republic, but they actually destroyed it. Caesar's heir succeeded where his adoptive father had failed, creating an empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. The blood spilled on the Ides of March had consequences that none of the participants could have anticipated, reminding us that even the most carefully planned actions can produce results that contradict their intended purposes. In this lies perhaps the deepest truth about human history, that our greatest triumphs and tragedies are often the unintended consequences of decisions made by people who thought they understood what they were doing, but were ultimately as blind to the future as we are to ours.